There's a story tucked away in the Christian Old Testament. It makes an appearance every now and again in our churches, but there's a good chance you haven't heard it in a long time. Maybe it's new to you. I'm talking about the book of Ruth. It's about 4 chapters long, around 85 verses, between the books of Judges and 1 Samuel in the Christian Bible. It's an easy 4 or 5 pages to skip over, but we are missing out if we don't tell this story. So often our greatest treasures are hidden to us in plain sight. The story of Ruth has been held up as an example of loving kindness or faithfulness or loyalty, depending on the translation. And it challenges each of us. It challenges each generation that tells and hears the story to remember outsiders, foreigners, enemies, those who are or who might feel unwelcome in our communities. The story begins in a time when judges judged. Before there were kings in the land of Israel, when there was no bread for those in Bethlehem, which means house of bread. And so Naomi, her husband, and her 2 sons fled from Bethlehem, from Israel, from their homeland to Moab, a land whose people are remembered in the Torah for not bringing food to the Israelites during their long wilderness journey. And because of this, according to the book of Deuteronomy, the Moabites were not allowed in the communities of Israel. So this was a real crisis. It was tragically ironic, and worse, after a time, Naomi's husband died. And after a time, her 2 sons died as well. Her 2 sons had married Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah, but they had no children, and now these 3 women were left without land or income or a community. They were caught in a borderland between cultures. Their options were surely limited. And this moment in the story reminds me of a walk I took once in the deserts of Arizona near the border of Mexico. After noticing both empty and full containers of water, blankets, some clothes, the evidence of migration and of humanitarian aid, we came across a small makeshift altar in the rock. There were prayer beads and candles and a crucifix. It was a place of significance for travelers, likely those seeking to cross the southern border of the United States. Perhaps the shrine began with the loss of a loved one. Like the desperation of Naomi in the land of Moab, I wonder what impossible decisions preceded this humble monument. Naomi encourages her daughters-in-law to return to their families in Moab. Broken-hearted and concerned for Naomi, both of them, Ruth and Orpah, protest, but Orpah eventually makes the sensible decision to go home, while Ruth, Scripture says, clings to her mother-in-law. "Wherever you go," says Naomi, "I will go." Arriving back in Bethlehem, Naomi sends Ruth to glean in nearby fields. Now, gleaning was the practice where those in need gathered what the harvesters had left behind. It wasn't just charity, but a social safety net mandated by law. The same law, coincidentally, that forbade Ruth from being a community member. The same law that forbade intermarrying with foreigners. And all of this makes the reaction of the field's owner, Boaz, even more surprising. Boaz was impressed by Ruth's love and faithfulness to Naomi, and he extends kindness and care to Ruth. After some fascinating and PG-13 storytelling, plus some helpful advice from Naomi, Boaz takes Ruth, the Moabite and widow, the stranger and political enemy, as his wife. This was economically risky as much as it was compassionate. Now, the actions of Ruth and Boaz are described by the Hebrew word chesed, which is the same word used in Micah 6:8 and all over the Hebrew Bible, really. "What does the Lord require of you," Micah writes, "but to do justice and to love kindness, or chesed, often translated mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. These words are front and center for me in my faith and for the identity of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which seeks to be a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. And if you'll allow me a shameless plug for just a moment, in a few weeks, beginning on Pentecost, May the 31st, we'll begin a series on the identity of this denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I hope it will offer something for those who've been around for a while, as well as those who are unfamiliar with the Disciples of Christ. I hope you'll tune in. And if you haven't already, I hope you'll join in this movement that welcomes all as God welcomes us. Now, back to the story where Ruth doesn't end with this marriage. The story of Ruth doesn't end with the marriage to Boaz. It ends well, but not without some controversy. Now, once Ruth and Boaz get married, she becomes pregnant. She gives birth to a son. This son brings Naomi's long journey through disaster and loss, from famine to nourishment, full circle. The son restores hope for Naomi, and the scripture gives credit to Ruth here, calling her better to Naomi than 7 sons. And right there, it is a beautiful ending. But something unexpected happens. In a way not seen anywhere else in Scripture, this royal genealogy is tacked on the end. It names Ruth's son Obed as the grandfather to King David. Now, so in these last 5.5 or so, out of the 85 verses in Ruth, the emphasis of the story is suddenly transformed from the kindness and faithfulness demonstrated by Ruth to Naomi into a story that on one hand adds inclusivity and gravitas for future male leaders, future male heroes. But on the other hand, it collapses the meaning of Ruth's own heroic actions into the systems of power that were and continue to be responsible for the conditions that force women and immigrants and minorities like Ruth and those experiencing poverty like Ruth and Naomi to desperate measures. It's possible that one of the only ways you've heard Ruth is by the mention of her name in the genealogy of Jesus in the book of Matthew. Now, the Gospel of Matthew includes 4 women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, in Jesus' ancestry. These women are united by a foreign status, by unconventional relationships, including prostitution in a few cases. Now, I'm not knocking King David. I'm certainly not knocking Jesus. There are positive ways to interpret these unorthodox genealogies. For one, the inclusion of all in the family of God. But it's important that we not make sacred cows out of what are really literary devices, which also imply that the sacrifice and ingenuity of these women, including Ruth, served only to enhance the reputations of the men named in the genealogies, even if one of those men is the Messiah. You might notice that in the 4th chapter of Ruth, once the child is born, once the shift to this royal genealogy is made, Ruth disappears. Her fate is left to our imagination. Now, of course, it's possible and maybe likely that she was taken care of, even venerated in her life, but it's also possible that once Naomi had an heir, Ruth was shunned because of her Moabite heritage. It's possible that Ruth was discarded once this soon-to-be royal lineage was founded or continued. The point of this exercise in interpretation is not simply to take apart the texts. Again, we're not knocking King David, we're not knocking Jesus, but we're trying to shine a light on the lived realities of oppressed and marginalized people in the witness of our scriptures and in our day-to-day life. To suggest that these stories, the stories through which we can meet God and listen for the Spirit's leading today, these stories are unfinished. We sang a hymn today with the lyrics, there is a wideness in God's mercy, like the wideness of the sea. It goes on to say, for the love of God is broader than the measure of my mind, of our mind. The chesed, the loving kindness of God, is wider than our imaginations. And as our understanding grows, which I hope it is, not only individually, but as a culture, as a people, as a whole people of God, as a global village, perhaps. As our understanding grows, so must the way we tell these stories. Now, before moving to Hawaii, my family lived near NASA's Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. It's where the movie Hidden Figures is set. The movie tells the story of 3 Black American women who each achieved many firsts in their careers and in NASA. One of these women, Katherine Johnson, calculated the trajectory of John Glenn's first manned spaceflight. Without her, Glenn's flight would not, well, it would have at least been delayed. We can say that. And there's this scene where Katherine's boss describes the challenge before them. He says, what I'm asking you to do is look beyond the numbers, look around them, look through them for answers to questions we don't even know to ask. Math that doesn't yet exist, because without it, we're not going anywhere. And the great lesson, I think, of Hidden Figures, and I think of Ruth, is that behind our most celebrated cultural moments, our triumphs, our monuments, and our histories, the work and lives and sacrifices of many is simply forgotten or rewritten or maybe even written out of the story. And scratching the surface of that truth might bring us, our stories, our lives closer to wholeness if we let it transform our relationship with God. John O'Donohue wrote that the real nature of things is hidden deep within them. Thomas Merton before him taught that there is in all things a hidden wholeness. And so, like the yeast that is the kingdom of heaven, the wholeness of God is hidden in plain sight. Maybe the secret to living in just community with one another, maybe the secret of finding our true selves is before us or all around us. Perhaps like the new math of Katherine Johnson, it's just beyond our stories, just beyond our creeds and our prayers. So let's look beyond. Let's look beyond to experience the reality of God's grace for all. Let's look beyond to see the hidden figures, the hidden wholeness of God's lived reality, God's resurrected reality in our lives, in this moment, for today and for the days to come. It's hidden in plain sight.